Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the DC Motions Debriefs. In this round of videos, we'll be breaking down motions that were set at SOSDC 2024. And I will specifically be dealing with the motion. This House believes that developing countries should drop local languages such as Tamil or Hindi in India, Urdu in Pakistan, Bengali in Bangladesh, in favor of English as the primary medium of instruction in schools. Now, before we get to the actual breakdown and analysis, a very brief intro to myself. As a school debater, I was part of the national debate team for 2021. Since then, I've become part of the Debaters Council, and I'm currently a coach at Methodist College. But I've also had the opportunity to both adjudicate and coach many of you in the Sri Lankan circuit, especially because I was part of the coaching team for the national pool in 2023. With the formalities out of the way, we can get into discussing and evaluating how best to approach a motion like this. But the very small clarification I want to make at the very top of this breakdown is that this is by no means the most exhaustive way to approach this motion. And I'm not trying to make it as exhaustive as possible, as much as I would like to provide you guys with a framework to approach a motion like this that does have so many moving parts. On the one hand, it's a motion that does require context in order to create your arguments and make them more applicable and therefore compelling to the panel as well as the other team. But secondarily, it's very much a policy debate that requires teams to almost provide metrics as to why, given the obvious harms and both in implementation and in the substance of the policy, why those metrics are important, A, and B, why either team wins on those metrics. So that's what this debrief is going to be. It's going to be an evaluation of how to approach this motion in prep and how that will then translate into actually debating the motion. So the big thing that I want to focus on is that, as I spoke about earlier, this is a motion that requires a lot of setup. And part of that setup is identifying the context that is relevant to developing countries. I think teams are very good at painting the picture of developing countries and the fundamental lack of resources that they have and how that's a persistent problem. This is a really great thing. But another thing that necessarily needs to be identified about developing countries in the context of language within schools is that developing countries are not homogeneous in most cases. They're likely to be extremely heterogeneous in both racial and ethnic composition, and this obviously has then impacts on the linguistic landscape of developing countries. Sri Lanka, for example, even though there is a majority and therefore a majority language, there's also ethnic minorities who may use a different language. This is true of most developing countries, and that's something that is a very key point of context. And it isn't something that remains, a pretty piece of context. It's something that has material implications on the debate and specifically the argument. And that's part of what I want teams to recognize, is that it's not just about saying this is true about developing countries. It's also why is this important? Why does it matter that developing countries have heterogeneous linguistic communities? And the reason why on proposition is because on proposition, you would talk about how varied the landscape of languages is an inhibitor to how accessible employment opportunities are, how accessible tertiary education is to members of communities who are locked out of professions that require you to have a proficiency in the majority language. On opposition, this context is also relevant because you're talking about individuals who, on balance, are likely to be more structurally oppressed than their majority counterparts. Because while it is true that developing countries typically have issues of poverty that affect a significant component of their population, it's likely to be the case that even there, minorities might have, it might be the case that minorities are more likely to be poor, more likely to lack resources, more likely to have a lack of access to educational resources than counterparts from majority communities. So that piece of context is relevant to both sides, and identifying that correctly and evaluating why that piece of context is important is something that I would recommend all teams to do. The second piece of context that is relevant here is what the role of English is, because I think there might be a tendency for teams to assume that in the propositions world, you will have English and it will be extremely pervasive within society because you're making this the standardized and primary medium of instruction. And in oppositions world, it's going to be the majority language. It's going to be majority languages taking dominance, or people can select whatever medium that they're comfortable when it comes to how they approach syllabi in school. However, what is key to understand is that English is likely to remain a relevant language and a relevant means of communication in either world. This is one, because many developing countries have been colonized, and the impacts of that colonization in terms of how English has seeped into the state apparatus is still present. It's likely that many state officers and associated jobs are likely to be in English, and this has then ripple effects to how state schools and state syllabi function. But more pertinently, or rather more immediately, globalization is also a thing, and it's likely that because of how interconnected countries have become, employment opportunities also rely on how proficient you are in English. And it might be the case that individuals with greater economic resources who want to send their children or their families abroad might choose to invest in their children's proficiency in English so that they can have access to jobs. So the sum total of this means that English is still a part of the developing country's language landscape, whether or not you make it a primary medium of instruction. So that's something that is relevant also on both sides. On the proposition, this becomes relevant because you are able to suggest that English is already something that creates socioeconomic divisions, because it's likely to be members of the majority, or it's likely to be individuals with greater economic resources who are able to independently learn English outside of the school system and capitalize on the lucrative job opportunities that are available to them while everybody else falls behind. Whereas on opposition, you can counter this also in setup and counter contextualization by suggesting that it's precisely because English is already a language that is absorbed in most cases into developing countries, into the communities within these landscapes. It can be a language that is taught in schools that isn't the primary medium. For example, many of us have learned English in our schools, but not as the primary medium of instruction. It might be the case that we've had to learn more subjects in Sinhala or Tamil, and English was taught as a linked language or a necessary skill. So that is a stance that you can take in opposition, that you wouldn't make English a primary medium, but it would be something that you either include as an additional subject amongst a series of subjects, and it's something that individuals can always pick up on later on in life, because it's a language they learn and they are proficient in, but not to the same extent of their native languages or the languages of their communities. So that's all in terms of setup and context. The next thing to know is in terms of the fact that this is quite clearly a policy motion. That means that you don't need to provide an explicit motion, but it's probably best for both teams to think about how developing countries are likely to roll out such a policy under the constraint of resources, A, but B, how they're likely to do this in a way that increases the efficiency of this motion, i.e. just be generous. We get that developing countries do have resource constraints, but given those resource constraints, how are they likely to employ these resources? How are they likely to retrain teachers? And that's another part of this debate that I would like teams to focus on, is again that there's a lot of practical difficulties in making this motion or rather this policy enforceable? And therein lies problems and certain benefits, right? Because it's not just that you need to train students in this new medium of instruction, it's also that teachers then need to be able to not just understand and be proficient in English, but also impart the knowledge that they have on their subjects and syllabi in that medium as well. So this means that teachers now have to understand how to explain science and history and maths to their students in English. So these practical concerns, it needs to be addressed. So the idea of having a graduated system of introducing English in propositions world as the primary medium, I don't think is an unreasonable way to approach this motion. You can say that it's going to be introduced at the primary level so that young kids are familiarized with English early. They will still be able to access certain subjects potentially in the medium of their communities. But this is also something that the opposition can capitalize on, because as much as the opposition would like to argue that this can be a gradual process, that you can gradually train teachers, when you think about it, really, it's very difficult to enforce this policy in a way that doesn't significantly leave people behind. Because how do you make this gradual? How do you learn history in Sinhala or Tamil from grades 1 through 5, and then jump to learning it in English from grades 6 through 12, right? Like there's no way to enforce this motion that isn't somewhat gradual, that isn't somewhat overnight, because it's impossible almost to learn a language, or rather learn a module or a subject in a particular language, for example, Tamil, and then have to sit that paper in English. It doesn't make sense. So there's likely to be some sense of immediacy about this motion that I think the opposition can capitalize on. So the sum total of everything I've just said is that think about your context, think about why that's important, and think about how that practically changes certain elements of your debate, but also be charitable. Even assuming children are able to absorb English at a young age, why then do you still prefer to not have it as the primary medium of instruction on opposition? And even in the propositions world, even assuming that individuals are more comfortable in the language of their communities, why do you still prefer English? Why do you want to make life harder? And part of that is understanding your burden. You need to prove that there is such significant benefits to learning English that this difficulty, this adjustment period, the growing pains of this policy, they're justifiable. Okay, so keeping all of this in mind, how do we approach this motion from proposition and opposition? There's broadly three main ideas that you can run with on proposition. The first is how you create greater socioeconomic and political mobility. This is on two main contexts and two main grounds. The first is on the basis that developing countries are likely to have very diverse communities. This is due to a number of reasons. But the underlying premise here is that, especially in countries like India, you're likely to have communities that, even though they're part of the same state, have languages that are totally different from each other. The reason why this is an issue is because it limits you both in terms of physical mobility as well as economic and therefore socio-political mobility as well. You are restricted to professions that accept your proficiency level in whatever language. So if you grow up learning Malayalam, if you grow up learning Tamil, how are you then able to get a job in a more urban area that, for example, requires you to have a working proficiency of Hindi? It's very difficult. You're restricted geographically. You're restricted in terms of the jobs and employment you can access. And the reason why this is particularly problematic is because it doesn't ensure meritocracy. It doesn't allow for individuals who are talented, who are capable, to access certain employment, even if their education has been wholesome, even if their education has fulfilled their purposes, because fundamentally they do not have the fundamental communication skills. The reason why this changes is because now you are able to have a standardized language. The more people who are able to absorb this and access this language, they're not restricted physically or economically anymore in terms of what type of jobs they can even apply to in the first place. The second context in which this occurs is even in nations where there isn't as fractious a division between ethnic lines and linguistic lines, you're still likely to have majorities or individuals who are from upper socioeconomic classes be able to entrench the structural advantages they have, because as we talked about, English has already sufficiently seeped into these nations. They've already seeped into the societal structures, the state mechanisms, and especially in the wake of globalization, it's likely to be the case that you're likely to have more and more individuals who are part of who understand English being employed in extremely lucrative employment opportunities, or you're facing the issue of brain drain, where everybody who learns English now can go abroad and pursue their careers because what exists there is mostly languages that use their native languages. The reason why this doesn't happen to the same extent in the propositions world is one, because now that more people have access to English and learn this and become proficient within this in their schools, it bridges that gap between richer communities being able to exclusively access higher levels of employment, because now even individuals from lower socioeconomic classes have access to competencies in English that they are able to become more proficient at. And it also secondarily prevents brain drain. It's somewhat of a difficult claim to make, but in a world where now the social structures within the country also adjust to the fact that more and more people learn English, you don't need to access foreign employment anymore if local employment can adjust to the fact that you are competent and proficient in English. So there's a couple of stray ideas here that also can be acknowledged, but for the interest of time, I won't be getting into them. The first is the idea that this can lead to tensions, which is something that teams can think about and explore. What does it mean that now you make it a standard, or rather in the opposition's world, it is always going to be majority languages that are going to be the default? How does this worsen the relationships between minorities and majorities? How do the feelings of being locked out of employment influence existing tensions, existing violence, existing sectarian conflict? There's an argument to be made there. And secondarily, on proposition, you'd also have to preempt the lines about cultural erasure, and you can talk about how there's incentives and just like traditional reasons to want to keep culture alive, albeit this argument is limited because naturally, as more and more communities adopt English, the likelihood of traditional languages and minority languages fading, it's quite intuitive. So the argument there is limited. There's a secondary idea under the proposition about how this, one, instills more faith in minority communities in the education system, and also then leads to less dropouts. This is because minorities often do not want to put their kids into school at the cost of using them, at the cost of perhaps using their labor in other ways, or generally, even if you're not using, even if minority children aren't explicitly pulled out of school to be used for labor, it might be the case that minorities don't have faith in the education system and therefore won't invest as many external resources to support this education process, because there's this visceral understanding that no matter how well their child does within this education system, it doesn't matter, because all of the most lucrative employment, it's going to be structurally set aside for members of the majority or members who have enough economic resources to access language learning skills that would allow them to access majority dominated jobs. In this world, because English is the standard that everybody can aspire, that everybody needs to adhere to within the syllabi that is taught from primary education onwards, it creates a more level playing field. There's also more analysis that you can provide as to how it's much more, English education is more accessible, in a world where the state has a dearth of resources and they can't pay as many teachers to teach you in Sinhala or Tamil or whatever your native language is, there's comparatively a lot more online resources that on scale are more accessible and more affordable, and therefore facilitate this process much more easily. Moving then on to op ideas and op arguments, you'd say the inverse, essentially. The first idea is that English education can make learning inaccessible for the simple reason that developing countries have very established systems of communal languages. So it doesn't matter how much English has seeped into developing countries. The issue is a vast majority of individuals probably don't speak English proficiently. The fact that you make English the primary medium of instruction essentially means that you make the process of learning much harder, not just on students, but on teachers as well, because now it is incumbent on them to teach the syllabus in a completely foreign language in what is likely to be a very sudden shift, because as we discussed earlier, it's almost impossible to gradually roll out this program because it needs to be something that is once enforced in primary. It just isn't logical that you can learn a language in your community and then perhaps do an exam in English. It's a very quick switch up. So it makes things very hard to learn. What does this do? It means that it's exclusively members who have access to economic resources that are able to pay for extra classes, pay for tuition, pay for the ability to understand the syllabus better, who are then able to access jobs in English. At least in the opposition's world, you are able to study in a medium of your choice and access jobs in those languages of your choice. Because the question of whether you actually need to learn English from primary, and make that the primary medium of instruction is unclear. Because if you have a competency in science or maths or history or whatever it is that you're learning that you would later then want a job in, English is needed mostly to communicate, or it's needed, or you need a proficiency level in whatever majority language. So whether it is necessary then to make it the primary medium of instruction in a world where the opposition can make it simply an additional course that you need to take, or an additional subject on top of history, science, maths, whatever it is that you're learning in whatever language that is comfortable to you. So that's a realm that the opposition can talk about. The second thing to identify here is how this can potentially restrict the type of professions and the type of things you learn when it comes to making English this primary medium of instruction. This is because when the learning is made much harder because you need to learn an alien language, you're probably going to pick subjects that are easier for you to learn in English as opposed to subjects that are probably economically better for you. If it's hard for you to learn scientific terms in English when you have learned them prior in Sinhala, or if you've learned them in a different language, it restricts these opportunities much later in life. There's also a secondary argument about how the state is going to enforce this policy extremely badly and it's going to be extremely inefficient. We've already talked about how it's very difficult to retrain teachers, but there's also this consideration of a majority language bias, because even when teachers teach you a certain subject in a certain language, they need to explain that to you in a way that you understand. So it's likely that within the process of explaining science to you in English or history to you in English, they might resort to a majority language in order to translate and explain that to you, either because it's the easiest way for them to explain that concept to the students, or it might be the case that because their training process has also been limited, it's likely to be something that manifests. So you're going to have majority language bias creep in even under a system where English is the sole language of instruction. So how does this affect the debate? That's something that teams can think of, and there's a lot to unpack there. So essentially, worsens inequality. There's majority language biases that creep in. This might have impacts on how individuals might pull out their kids because they might not, they still might struggle learning English. in response to the proposition push that there's a wealth of online content, the problem is you need to be able to understand that content. You need to have an in-person teacher who is able to explain the components of that you don't understand in the language that you, in a language that you are comfortable with. So these are the big ideas under prop and opposition. For the interest of time, I won't be going any further, but there's also a question of how viable your employment base is. Is English necessary in order to make, in order to attract investment, in order to attract the setting up of companies and corporations, and attracting and using local talent in locally established businesses? Case examples of China compared to Sri Lanka, how these things apply. I'll leave it up to teams to decide. But if there's one thing, or rather two things that I would like when it comes to this particular debrief to be absorbed by debaters, is one, always think about how the context of this motion applies to your arguments, but secondarily in a policy debates, what physically and structurally changes, and how do those changes either make this system more accessible, make it more valuable in terms of quality, and assess it on metrics, because policy debates need to be assessed on metrics of sustainability, of accessibility, of quality, in order for you to effectively win the debate.